Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. Well, as I mentioned, my guest here in the studio, local archaeologist Paul Reed, who is here in the studio with us for the very first time in our visual radio studio. Paul, welcome back to KSJE.
Scott, so glad to be here and actually in person.
In person, right. In our new digs, you're not here by Skype or in some exotic locale. You're right here across the table from me, so welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I love your new setup here.
Thank you.
This looks amazing.
It is very, very nice. We're very proud of it. And again, it's thanks to the community, thanks to San Juan College and the supporters that we have here who support KSJE. We couldn't do it without them. So we appreciate them for making this all possible and giving us some new tools to make some real cool programs with. So
right.
Good to have you here. And so as I mentioned, we're talking about Irish bog bodies this morning, right?
Right.
Little twist on our usual topic.
It is. And, you know, I don't know if the listening audience is tired of Southwestern archaeology. I never get tired of it.
I would think not, but yeah.
We do have interesting things that pop up, as you said, across the pond. And
right.
Yeah, one of those things is this whole area of study of bog bodies. Basically, there are over 100 individuals at this point who have been found in various points in the Irish bogs. And there's several dozen from different points around Europe as well. And what's really interesting about, you know, these settings is this is a very low oxygen area. It's considered anaerobic. The water is pretty cold in these bogs. And basically, these bodies can be super well preserved for literally thousands of years. I think the earliest we've got is somewhere around 2200 BCE. So we're looking at something that's over 3,000 years old.
Right.
And then they range all the way up into, you know, the fairly recent present. But the most interesting group of these that people have been studying are between about 500 BCE and just, you know, 500 CE or so. So about 1,000 years worth sort of Ireland's Iron Age. And just a number of individuals who were intentionally, they think in some cases, perhaps other cases not intentionally, go into the bog. And there they stay. Until
some kind of sacrifice, or what do we think?
Yeah, that's one of the theories. A couple of individuals who look like they either had war injuries or perhaps some intentional, sacrificial type stuff done to their body, cuts and things, put into the bogs, sometimes with interesting artifacts, sometimes not, just the individuals sort of tossed in. But again, the preservation is amazing. You know, there's a photo here that I'm looking at on an Irish archaeology webpage, and you can see the detail in this particular individual's hand.
I'm showing it right now. If folks are watching on our Facebook page and YouTube channel, you can kind of see what we're talking about.
Yeah, and just really an amazing level of preservation. And
this photo, this hand that we're looking at, is about how old do we think?
This is from an individual who's about 2,500 years.
Okay,
was in the water 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
And they, individuals find these, and in Ireland, archaeological finds don't belong to individuals. A lot of times people get finder's fees and they get compensated if it's on their land. But what's really cool about Irish archaeology, and really in much of Europe and the world, is archaeological resources and remains are state property. So people report them when they find them.
Right.
They get something out of it, and then these remains go into museums and they get studied. So in this case, this individual is at the National Museum in Dublin and has been studied extensively.
And these remains, if you will, tell us a lot about this period of time because of the preservation, right? And it is the unique qualities of the bog, I guess, that keeps these folks so well preserved.
Right. It's both the lack of oxygen and the coolness of the bog, and basically bacteria does not act on these bodies because of those conditions.
But it's not just being found like in the ocean or a body of water. That would be a different situation. There's not any animals in there that are going after you and all kinds of other things that help preserve the body.
Right. The bogs are a very unique setting because they're real quiet. So you don't have hardly any movement in the water. And then you can actually get water at depth and then peat and other things filling in on top of that.
Right.
And the Irish, of course, still traditionally, not all of them, but some of them burn the peat. So they chop it out in chunks, they dry it, and then they put it in their hearths because at this point, of course, Ireland doesn't have much in the way of forests. So as people do that, they get down to these watery layers that have essentially been sealed for hundreds of years. And then sometimes there are people in them and artifacts and all kinds of cool stuff. So, to contrast that with
archaeologically speaking,
well,
cool
yes,
stuff. Yes,
from my perspective,
right.
To contrast that with the oceans are constantly moving, rivers are moving, and we occasionally get things in lake settings. But again, the bog is this unique intersection of low oxygen, cool temperatures, and very little movement. So it actually duplicates, ironically enough, dry caves and other mummified remains that we see from different spots around the world.
Right.
But the bog bodies have even more detail in some ways than mummified remains because you see skin, you see hair, nails, you can do all kinds of studies, clothing, a lot of things are just perfectly intact.
And in looking at some of the articles you shared with me before we came on the air this morning, I mean, there's, again, evidence of what the last meals were or their diet and things like that you can discern because of the preservation of the bodies.
Right. There's a whole field, and there have been different remains, different parts of the world, but scientists go in and they study the remains of the stomach and the intestines, and not things that most of us want to do before breakfast.
Right.
But we learn a lot about diet. One of the individuals, apparently, they think he went in at some point in the autumn, and this was a range of like 200 to about 180, but that he had summer foods, had seeds and grasses and a little bit of indications of some kind of harvest potentially, and then apparently went in. Another individual had a greater meat composition in his belly. So we get great clues on how people lived, what was important to them, clothing, hairstyles, everything. One individual had a specific hairstyle with his hair slicked back. So this is like the 50s look with the Brill cream.
Okay.
But he used resin.
That wasn't bog induced. That was actually natural.
That was actually there.
Something you wanted to do.
They found hints of resin in the hair that was preserved, and so this guy had slicked back his hair 2,500 years ago.
Okay,
and so all the the Lords of Flatbush and et cetera from the 50s. Those guys thought they were inventing everything. It's all been done.
Not so much, apparently.
I think that's the message from archaeology. It's all been done. You got to put your own little innovative turn on it. But most things go way back.
Interesting. Of course, we don't know why he did that, right? That's the mystery at this point.
Well, right. It's some kind of hairstyling. So whether it was a personal thing, part of a group, it could have been ritual potentially.
But do we know that there was much hairstyling going on back in this period of history?
We have different indications with different haircuts that have been preserved in different mummified remains and, of course, with the bog bodies. So I don't think there's any super clear patterns at this point.
Right.
But so, people have been decorating their hair for a long time.
Evidently.
So, imagine the stylists back then.
Right. I don't know what tools. You don't have scissors. You've got what? Sharp tools, I guess, to try to do something with your hair.
Well, these are Iron Age, so they probably had pretty good
some blades.
cutting tools.
All right. Well, good. Okay. Thank you.
But no moose.
I'm going too far back. Yeah. Got it. Okay. But fascinating. And so in Ireland and in that area of the world, then, how many of these bogs are there? I guess it would be scattered throughout the country as where these discoveries are coming from, right? Not just one particular spot.
Right. I don't have a real sense of that percentage of the land-wise, but I think it's sizable. I think it's, has to be a couple of % of the overall land mass that has these. Because, again, people have relied on cutting peat out of these bogs. They cut it and dry it and burn it in their hearths. And that's a big industry. In fact, they're worried at this point, I think, just from an environmental standpoint, that some of the bogs are disappearing and the peat deposits are really being depleted. So, but these are scattered across Ireland. There's some in England. We get them in Scandinavia. So it's a unique environmental setting, but not unique to Ireland.
Right.
So.
But again, finding these bodies and these things is somewhat unique.
It is.
to that area, right?
It is, because, we have swampy areas in the States, across the South, like in Louisiana, Florida,
Sure.
Georgia, other areas, and we do not have things like these coming out. So
Right.
we just don't have that particular combination of environmental setting.
Interesting. And so from an archaeological standpoint, again, to find out and to study kind of what was going on with these individuals, whether it was a ritualistic thing or just a burial thing or somebody just slipped and fell thing, I suppose it could be all those scenarios.
Right, and I think that probably, covers it along with other possibilities we might think of. One individual who works with the National Museum in Ireland has staked out some turf and said he thinks this is ritual sacrifice of humans. He thinks that one individual in particular who was a tall guy, he was 6'6", really amazingly tall for the time and even today.
Right.
Had, certain things done to his body. They weren't sure if it was while he was living, post-mortem, but things that might suggest, cutting, torturing, etc. And then this individual was put in the bog. So his idea is that this individual was basically sacrificed to, the pre-Christian deities and gods in order to bring about good things. He thought this individual was a chieftain or an Irish king. But other people have said, well, we don't have a whole lot of other evidence to connect to that particular train
right.
at this point. So, and then these people simply could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time and somebody came across them, wanted their goodies, whether it's gold or whatever, took them out and tossed them in.
Their hair resin.
Yeah,
maybe
they wanted
that. I don't know.
Right. That 500 BC hairstyle with the
right.
resin slicking down the hair. And unfortunately humans kind of do this. They're not always nice to each other, and we know that goes way, way back in time as well.
Right.
It wasn't invented by any particular group on
sure.
the planet. So there's sort of the ritual sacrifice, organized thing versus random murderous behavior theory.
Right.
And probably plenty of room in between, because some of the bodies, in fact, do come out, and they don't look like they died violent deaths. But as with anything, the gruesome details of different time periods in our history draw attention. And,
sure.
It happened, but the more mundane nature of this is probably people just living their lives and, ending up in the bog. And it's also possible that this was seen as an entry point into the underworld or, other points in the afterlife, and that people were deliberately introduced just in non-murderous, non-sacrificial ways.
Right.
Just sent on to whatever lay beyond and whatever their beliefs were about the afterlife.
Sure.
And there seems to be a couple of cases of that, too.
But we have burials, too, at the same time in the
Sure,
ground, so
we do.
this would be a different procedure.
It definitely would, and it would, there's something special going on, and I think that's part of what the Irish archaeologists are still working on.
Right, interesting.
Understanding that.
And when we look at other groups of people who are living around the world at the same period of time, it's similar stuff, right? We have certain beliefs and different beings and gods or what have you, and different
Right.
maybe rituals or ceremonials or sacrifices and things like that. It's not just happening in these bogs, it's happening all over the globe, is it not?
Right, exactly. And part of this, definitely, these folks are Celts, more than likely, at least the ones around 500 BCE to 500 AD, and they are practicing probably Celtic beliefs. It's a warrior society in part, so we do have individuals buried with weapons, and so again, not the happiest of times, but this is what people did,
Right?
And not, like you said, not unique worldwide in terms of how people are relating to each other in the landscape. These folks are farmers. They're mostly just eking out their living, growing different crops, raising cows and things. But occasionally you have conflict, and then you have the development of the Gaelic warrior societies, which is really interesting.
Right. And there is some mobility at this time, too. So folks are exploring and traveling and at least moving
Right.
around in that Northern European map.
Right, definitely, because, the best evidence suggests that Ireland was populated or repopulated, mixed in with Celts coming from the east primarily. And the Celts have been tracked to sort of far Western Asia, sort of far Eastern Europe, and that there was a movement of peoples. This is part of the waves of people that also sort of besets ancient Rome, over a period of time from 200 BC to about 500 AD.
Right.
And some of those folks filtered through and then ended up in Ireland, England, and other places. So, and they brought, all this culture and these things they were doing, their beliefs, and some of them ended up in the bogs.
Sure.
For later study.
And as you mentioned, with the Iron Age, I mean, that really does bring a lot of technological advancements for the time to these human beings who are living and traveling and
Right.
fighting and trying to get along or not trying to get along, whatever the case may be.
Right. Once they started smelting iron, the weapons in particular got a lot better. So we've got, pretty good swords and things at this era, and they're beginning to develop armor as well. So better ways to fight
and kill, right? And
right,
injure
because,
and maim.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, because again, this is a large part of human history almost anywhere we look.
Sure.
But it's not the only part. So,
True.
We keep that balance in mind and
very true.
Try to understand these folks in the total context in which they lived.
Exactly. And again, all of this goes into the sum of knowledge that we learn, that the archaeologists, as you and I talk about seemingly every month, to kind of put into these theories and either back up the existing theories or propose new ideas of what this evidence tells us.
Right. And again, archaeology is a growing science, and we bring in new data. We look at things. We struggle with, is this a better explanation? Is this one? Sometimes we don't resolve those things, and we roll forward with competing viewpoints. And I think right now, the bog bodies and why people were put into bogs is part of that. But from my perspective, the truth always lies in sort of that middle ground, with this probably happening, this happening, and this happening. So we've got different behaviors going on.
Very interesting. Paul Reed is my guest this morning. He works with Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins. Paul, we're going to take a short break.
Sounds
and
good.
When we come back, we'll keep talking about bog bodies, but we'll also talk about some other things that are going on as well. Back with my guest with more in just a moment right here on KSJE. This program is supported by MyLabs, patient-ordered testing. San Juan Regional Medical Center is expanding its services to offer low-cost blood screenings year-round. Now offering walk-in convenience to get the blood tests you want when you want them. MyLabs, patient-ordered testing, is available at the hospital's laboratory and the Outpatient Diagnostic Center on 30th Street in Farmington. With nearly 20 tests available, there's an option for everyone. MyLabs, patient-ordered testing, a wellness service of San Juan Regional Medical Center. I'm Scott Micklin. My guest on the radio this morning from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, Paul Reed, is here in the studio. Good morning once again.
Good morning, Scott.
Thanks for being here in person.
Glad to be here.
We appreciate you wherever we can catch up with you. Some days it's at home, some days it's on the road, some days it's here.
That's right. I love your new studio. This is a great setup.
Thank you very much. We're very proud of it. And again, it's because of the support we get from the community. KSJE, as a reminder, everyone, is a listener-supported radio station, so we couldn't do what we do without the support of many local residents and businesses and, of course, San Juan College. So it's great to be able to share it with the community, which is what we like to do. So good to have you here.
Indeed.
We were talking about bog bodies in the first part of the program and some interesting archaeological discoveries in Ireland and that area of the world. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is this use of LIDAR, which is this type of radar, I guess, or similar concept of radar, but it's LIDAR. So the acronym is a little different.
Right.
And they're using that in some of the parts of the world. South America comes to mind, and Central America, to really kind of get underneath the tree canopies to see the landscape, and they're uncovering a lot of previously maybe undiscovered stuff.
Right. I don't think it's an overestimation to say that this is revolutionizing discovery of archaeological sites and historic sites worldwide. So LIDAR is laser scanning from basically low altitude planes. So we're talking 1,000 feet, even lower in some cases. The planes fly over. They're using lasers basically to capture imagery of the ground. So there's photographs, there's laser imagery. And what makes the LIDAR particularly interesting is you collect all those data and you literally end up with billions of points that are collected, depending upon how the instruments are set. Then you bring those back, and there's pretty intensive processing with computers. But what you can do with the LiDAR ultimately is you can strip away all the vegetation. So if you are in Central America, you're looking for Mayan remains or Toltec sites, etc., you can basically take the jungle away as you process. And that's what they used down in the Mayan country and found an amazing set of sites in showing one particular spot.
Yeah, I'm showing a bit of a story from National Geographic on our screen at the moment for folks who are watching, and you can kind of see the two different images of the forest in apparently Guatemala, modern-day Guatemala, and then when you take away that tree canopy and the trees, kind of what that LiDAR is showing underneath that and the sites that you can see above the trees, but there's much, much more.
Right, and this, LiDAR allows large areas to be scanned, photographed, assessed with relatively low expense. I mean, it's not cheap. I think we can do it here in the Southwest for about $1 an acre is what I've heard.
Okay.
So if you wanted to fly a large area, you'd be looking at several $100,000 potentially. And we can talk about a study that was done on that in a minute.
But compared to boots on the ground archaeology?
Exactly. Compared to walking it and going through all that. And, in the desert, we see things. If it's there, we're going to see it. The LiDAR helps us find things that are subtle. In the jungles of Central America and other places worldwide, you're not even going to know where to begin looking.
Right.
And you might just want to survey a particular block of land, and that's what archaeologists do. If we have known Mayan sites or others, then archaeologists will design a survey program to go out and do what's called a pedestrian survey, and you literally walk through the jungle. But, your friend there is a giant machete because you're going to have to cut your way through. What the LiDAR allows is an assessment of much larger areas in a much more rapid fashion, and then people can go in and say, hey, there's a bunch of interesting, cool things here. Maybe there's some temples and pyramids. Maybe there's just some residential sites. So then you dispatch the crews, and you still have to cut away the jungle, but at least you know where to go and to do it. So again, it's a revolutionary tool for finding things.
And it's only been around for, the last few years, right?
Yeah, the LiDAR technology is no more than a decade old.
Yeah.
It allows us to do this. We can also do super fine LiDAR work up close. So if we have like a rock panel with different images, petroglyphs, pictographs, we can go in with a machine that'll scan that and produce extremely high resolution photographs and maps that way. So you can both do the focused work that way and then the aerial coverage. And, it's amazing technology.
Right. And so in our area, of course, because we don't have a lot of trees and tree canopies, and especially not out in the open desert where a lot of these sites are located, it's not quite as advantageous, I guess, to use it here, but can it still show some things that have been buried for eons?
Right. It can, and it's, but it doesn't get to the buried stuff. So that's a different remote sensing technique that I think we've talked about. We've talked about magnetometer, which actually gives you a hint of what's going on beneath the ground penetrating radar. The LiDAR actually works with the surface. But what it does do is it picks up very subtle surface features that if, let's say, you're walking out north of Chaco, for example, on the Greater Chaco landscape, you're looking for potential road features. We know that the Great North Road comes out of Chaco, and there's 3 or 4 segments at different points that are parallel, and then that comes down to a single segment. And that's been pretty well documented. But let's say we're looking at an outlier site that's off the North Road a ways, and we suspect there's roads, maybe a road that connects it back to Chaco or back to another site on the North Road. You could walk those areas physically with a pedestrian survey. You might not see anything. If you do the LiDAR study, you might see more subtle features that are not there, which would then give you data to go out in the field. And in fact, there was just such a study done as part of the work that BLM is doing to modify their management plan for this area, which we've talked about. And this is the Farmington BLM.
Right.
They commissioned LiDAR over a large span of an area surrounding Chaco Canyon and then going up the North Road and then certain areas up here in Farmington, Aztec, Bloomfield that hadn't been covered through prior work. So we really have a nice body of data now, and we've started to look at that with some folks who are specialists at basically teasing out features on the landscape, again, in the lab, and saying, hey, this looks like this might be a potential road. So when we get those data, then we can go out in the field and say, oh, okay, this is a 2-track road, or it's a road that's accessing this modern house or this historic house, or it's an old pipeline, linear scar from a 1950s pipeline. We see those.
Right.
But once you get away from, you sort of screen out the modern effects, then you can get back to things that are older. We found wagon roads this way, and Chacoan roads are detectable this way.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's really a very useful tool. The processing time can be high, like I said, and then people have to actually do some work, comparing aerial images and the LiDAR. We can also use heat data. This is something that NASA gathers routinely, and I have a colleague who's tapped into that and is helping us assess that. So we have these different methods of basically seeing what the ground looks like today and what it might have looked like in the past.
Sure. And for someone like me who has no archaeological experience except talking to you every month, so I must have some degree somewhere,
you
right?
do now.
Something, some credits will transfer over. But it's really fascinating to me to see pictures of these things, these techniques, or these landscapes that apparently are roads or evidence of roads, and it really is hard for me to see them, but apparently not so much for people like you to see them.
Right.
But it's a real subtle difference.
There are subtle differences, in the Chaco roads, the ones that had the most energy input and were the most well constructed are fairly obvious once you know what to look for, because they appear as swales. So they're areas that were actually excavated in some ways. Dirt was cleared, and then you've got a roadway, and a lot of times rocks were lined up for curbing. So some of them are very obvious, but then there are points on the landscape.
I guess I haven't seen those pictures, but
No.
I've seen the other ones.
Over time, the landscape erodes, you lose some of these things, you get into badlands, and they disappear completely. And we do have different areas like that out in the basin. And in other areas, you see them perfectly in air photos. You can confirm them with LiDAR, and you go out and you go, wow.
Right.
This is really subtle, and I'm not really seeing this. But the aerial imagery tells us that that was a road, in fact. So, so that's why we have that level of technology to assist us in seeing things that we may not see real clearly on the ground.
Sure. So in New Mexico, maybe not so much of a place for this LiDAR technology, but I would think maybe in Colorado, maybe some of the mesa tops and things like that, even though there's not a lot of trees, there is still ground cover. Is that a different story?
Yeah, it's been used effectively, and not just in archaeological studies. People use it for wildlife management because you can detect game trails. You can detect changes in patterns of vegetation. Because I spoke about, in the Mayan jungles about making the vegetation go away. But if you're interested in the vegetation,
right,
the LiDAR lets you highlight different aspects of that.
Oh.
And you can really see the difference in patterning between grasslands, sagebrush, scrublands, and then making the transition to actual forests. So, yeah, it's a useful tool really across the West in a lot of different studies in the environmental and cultural fields.
Interesting. Paul Reed is my guest this morning. He works with Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, and we're talking a little bit about some of the activities going on in this part of the world. And Paul, we only have about maybe 5 minutes left or so this morning, and I know you've been doing a lot of work on the Greater Chaco area. You've been working with some of the Pueblo governors and tribal areas that have interest in the Greater Chaco area. Can you give us an update on
sure
what your conversations have been like with them and what's happening?
Yeah, one of the things that is happening is our senators Heinrich and Udall have introduced a bill to withdraw some acreage around Chaco Canyon. We've talked, and our partners and allies have talked for a few years about trying to protect Chaco. So we have Chaco Culture National Historic Park, and then we have areas around it that have different oil and gas and other mineral resources. And we've talked about having some of those lands removed from additional oil and gas exploration at this point. I think as we've talked on the show before, this area is about 91% leased. So, and this goes from Chaco area south quite a distance all the way up to here in Farmington. And there's a lot of different points of access already on the landscape for the oil and gas resources. So we're talking about putting some additional protections in place. So there's a bill that was introduced in the Senate, and Pueblo leaders went out this past week from the Pueblos of Acoma. I think we had Zuni and some Hopi leaders all go to Washington, D.C. to basically lobby for greater protections. And of course, for Pueblo people, Greater Chaco is their ancestral landscape. Mm-hmm. And of course, then we have lots of Navajo folks in the area, and the Navajo Nation as well is interested in putting some protection on this land. So that's one of the directions we're heading. We're also working with the Pueblo of Acoma to go out later this month and look at some specific areas on the land that might have basically clues to Acoma's origin stories, to their oral history, and connections to Chaco Canyon. So, and that's an ethnographic study that we're particularly interested in and pretty excited about.
Interesting. And with that being said, how many acres are we talking about that would be up for more protection?
We're looking at a pretty small amount of acreage in the overall. I think the Farmington Field Office manages something like 7.8 million acres. So we're looking at about 300,000, just over that, for areas where the federal minerals would be withdrawn from future leasing. And that would still allow the access points that are already on the landscape in terms of well pads and et cetera.
Right.
But this begins a process of protecting some of these areas and really sort of looking ahead to 20 years, 30 years when, this oil field has passed through the period that's going to pass through. And how does this landscape look in the post-oil and gas, era for the Greater Chaco area? Because, we're not going to be doing oil and gas forever out there. these are finite resources. So, and the oil and gas will shift and it'll be found in other places. But we want to think ahead towards how this landscape will look once we pass through this particular time period.
Sure. But I know that there's a lot of folks who would say, well, maybe the way we get oil and gas now might change. But as we've seen even recently, we thought we couldn't get oil out of shale, and here we are.
Right.
We were able to do that. So the technology may allow us to find oil in places we didn't know it was there before. So it may not be as finite as we think.
Well, right. The shale resources have, certainly revolutionized what folks are doing in the oil and gas work, for sure. But we're trying to envision the landscape in a different sense.
Still a longer term look.
It's a longer term vision, and how we get energy and use energy in 40 years, 50 years, it's it may be based on some oil and gas and coal, but odds are we're going to be doing other things by that point, because that's also the nature of the technological advancement. Right.
And so this is underway, and again, you have the support of the tribal entities, the Pueblos that have a direct connection to Chaco, it seems.
Right. We've worked real closely with a group called the All Pueblo Council of Governors. So this is the 19 New Mexico Pueblos plus the one that's in Texas, Isleta del Sur, which is actually folks originally from New Mexico. So I meet with that group several times a year. We update them on the work we're doing, and they raise concerns that they have. And they're really closely connected as well to working with BLM, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They've had a great deal of input on the Bureau of Reclamation's Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project.
Right.
And so I think at this point, the Pueblo people are really mapping on to the best ways to advocate for their ancestral sites. And really what we're doing with Archaeology Southwest is trying to help elevate and raise those voices for the people whose ancestors lived on the land, and
Sure.
be sure that we take that into account as we continue to develop and do what we're doing in the modern world.
Right. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but I do want to remind everyone that Chaco Canyon proper is always protected. That is not what we're talking about. It is this greater Chaco area, which is kind of this other kind of buffer zone around the park, and where there are other ruins and other discoveries and other things that are being encroached by some of the development. And if we're not careful, that's the concern.
Right, exactly. The Chaco Canyon is a national park. It's protected under our current laws, but we get outside Chaco and we're into a mix of lands. We have BLM managed lands, BIA lands, Navajo Nation lands, State of New Mexico lands, and some other private as well. So, we call it the checkerboard, and that's really what it looks like when you look on a map. So it's a complicated landscape to try to have input on, and I think the agencies are doing their best to manage this, but they require input from the public, from tribes, from other interested groups. So if folks have concerns about this, I really do encourage them to contact the local BLM. BLM is now telling us that they will have a draft of their long-range resource management plan completed at some point. It could be this month, it might be in November, but it's approaching a period of weeks when we'll see this. And this is something that our organization and our partners have worked on now for 5 years. So, we're very interested to see that document and to, provide input along the lines where we feel like we can have some positive impact.
Right. Very good. Well, Paul, we are out of time, I'm sorry to say, but always fascinating conversations with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. Always great to be here.
Appreciate you coming over, and we will see you again in about a month.
We will.
All right. Very good. That's Paul Reed, my guest from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins here on KSJE. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.